Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going to the moors. We are going to a place where the wind never stops, where it comes across the hilltops with a sound like breathing, like the long, slow exhalation of something enormous and unseen. Something that has been breathing since before there were people to hear it, and that will go on breathing long after the last person has turned away. This is the story of the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne. 3 women who grew up in this wild, lonely, heartbreakingly beautiful place, and who wrote novels that changed the world and who died, all 3 of them before the age of 40, taken by the same disease, in the same house, within a few years of each other, like candles on a mantelpiece blown out one by a draught that no one could find and no one could stop. It is also the story behind Wuthering Heights, the most passionate, most savage, most extraordinary novel in the English language. A book that was written by a woman who barely left her father's house, who published under a man's name, who never married, who never travelled, who walked the moors every day with her dog and came home and sat at the dining room table and wrote, in a small tight hand on scraps of paper, a love story so fierce and so uncompromising that it shocked the Victorian world to its core. The critics called it brutal. They called it coarse. They called it a book that no woman could have written. They were wrong about many things, but they were right about one. No ordinary woman wrote Wuthering Heights. Emily Brontë was not ordinary. She was a force of nature, as wild and as untamable as the moors she loved, and the novel she wrote was not a fiction but a landscape, a map of the interior of a soul that had been shaped by wind and solitude and loss. But here is the thing that no one tells you when they hand you a copy of Wuthering Heights and tell you it is a great book. The real story, the story of the family that produced it, is sadder than anything in the novel. Heathcliff lost Catherine. The Brontes lost everyone. They lost their mother. They lost their 2 eldest sisters. They lost their brother. They lost Emily. They lost Anne. They lost Anne. They lost Charlotte. And at the end of it all, there was a 77-year-old man sitting alone in a parsonage on the edge of the moors, surrounded by the books his children had written, and the silence they had left behind, and the wind outside never stopped, and the heather went on blooming, purple and gold and brown, season after season, indifferent to everything. Tonight we will walk through that story from beginning to end. We will walk through the rooms of the parsonage and across the moors and into the pages of the books that the Brontes wrote, and we will try to understand how a family so small and so isolated could produce 3 of the greatest novelists in the history of the English language, and why the price of that genius was so unspeakably high. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you, whether you are here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history. I am glad you are with me. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Now let us begin. The moors. We must begin with the moors, because the moors are where everything begins and everything ends in this story, and because you cannot understand the Brontes without understanding the landscape that made them. The Yorkshire moors are not like any other landscape in England. They are not the gentle rolling countryside of the south, with its hedgerows and its orchards and its tidy villages. They are not the dramatic peaks of the Lake District, or the soft green valleys of the Cotswolds. They are something else entirely, something that resists easy description, a vast, open, treeless expanse of heather and coarse grass and dark peat that stretches across the tops of the Pennine Hills like a blanket thrown over the bones of the earth. The ground is soft and wet, spongy with centuries of accumulated moisture, and in places the peat is so deep that you could sink into it up to your waist if you stepped off the path. The water that seeps out of the peat is the color of strong tea, brown and clear and faintly acidic, and it gathers in streams that cut through the heather in channels, so narrow that you can step across them, the water running fast and cold over beds of gritstone and millstone grit. The colors of the moors change with the seasons in ways that are so subtle and so continuous that the landscape seems to breathe, to shift its palette the way an animal shifts its coat. In late summer, when the heather is in bloom, the moors turn purple, a deep, rich, almost impossibly saturated purple that covers the hillsides from horizon to horizon, and that has a smell, warm and sweet, and slightly resinous, the smell of honey and dust and sunlight on dry earth. In autumn, the bracken turns gold, and then brown, and then a russet so dark it is almost red, and the combination of the fading heather and the dying bracken gives the moors the look of a vast, muted tapestry, the colors bleeding into each other the way watercolors bleed on wet paper. In winter, the moors are brown and grey and black, the heather stripped of its flowers, the grass flattened by the wind, the peat exposed in patches where the rain has washed the surface away, and the sky sits low on the hills, a heavy, uniform grey that seems to press down on the land with a physical weight, as though the sky itself were tired and wanted to rest. And the wind. The wind is the thing that everyone who has been to the moors remembers. It is constant, relentless, a presence so continuous that after a while you stop hearing it as a sound and start feeling it as a condition, an aspect of the environment as fundamental as gravity or light. The wind comes from the west, from the Irish Sea, and the Atlantic beyond, carrying moisture, and the smell of salt, and the particular chill of air that has been travelling over open water for hundreds of miles. It moves across the moors with a sound that is unlike any other sound in nature, a low, sustained moan that rises and falls in pitch as the wind encounters obstacles, rocks and walls and the ruins of old farmhouses, and that can, on a strong day, build to a howl that makes conversation impossible and that fills the head with a noise so vast and so impersonal that it seems to come from inside you rather than outside, as though the wind were blowing through your skull, scouring out everything that was in there and replacing it with emptiness. In spring, the moors come alive with a speed and a violence that is startling after the long, brown, silent winter. The heather sends up new shoots, bright green against the dark peat. The bilberry bushes leaf out. The cotton grass appears, its white tufts bobbing in the wind like small flags of surrender. The curlews return, their haunting, bubbling call carrying across the moor from great distances, the sound falling and rising and falling again like water poured from a height. The lapwings perform their tumbling display flights over the nesting grounds, their wings making a thrumming sound that the Yorkshire people call peewit, and the skylarks ascend from the grass in vertical spirals, singing as they climb, their song pouring down from such a height that the bird itself is invisible, a tiny speck lost in the vastness of the sky, and the song seems to come from the sky itself, from the blue, from the light, from the air. And in all seasons, in all weather, the moors have a quality that is difficult to describe and that Emily captured better than anyone has captured it before or since. It is a quality of honesty. The moors do not pretend, they do not charm. They do not flatter or seduce or offer comfort. They are what they are, rock and heather and sky and wind, and you can take them or leave them. But if you take them, if you give yourself to them the way Emily gave herself to them, they will give you something in return that you cannot get anywhere else. A sense of perspective, a sense of scale, a sense that your problems and your sorrows and your little human dramas are real and valid and important, but that they are also, in the grand scheme of things, very small, and that the smallness is not a diminishment, but a consolation, because the moors will be here long after you are gone, and the heather will bloom again in August, and the wind will blow, and the sky will be blue or grey or the colour of beaten silver, and none of it will care about you, and this indifference, this vast, ancient, impersonal going on of things, is the closest thing to peace that the world can offer. This is the landscape that made the Brontes. This is the landscape that Emily walked every day, setting out from the parsonage with her dog, Keeper, a fierce, bull-headed mastiff who loved her and no one else, and striking out across the moors in weather that would have kept most people indoors. Rain and wind and the thick, cold mists that descended on the hilltops without warning and that turned the world into a grey, formless void in which direction was meaningless and distance was impossible to judge. She walked for hours. She walked until her boots were soaked through and her hair was plastered to her face and her clothes were heavy with moisture, and the cold had settled into her bones in a way that would take hours by the fire to shift. And then she came home and sat at the table and wrote. Emily's relationship with the moors was not recreational. It was not the relationship of a person who enjoys fresh air and exercise. It was something deeper and stranger, something that the people around her recognized as extraordinary, even if they could not explain it. She needed the moors the way other people need conversation or company or love. They were her church, her library, her social life, her therapy. When she was on the moors, she was fully herself, fully alive, the shy, awkward, sometimes hostile person who struggled in drawing rooms and schoolrooms and any enclosed space that contained strangers, becoming, on the open hilltop, someone powerful and free and entirely at ease. She knew the moors, the way a farmer knows his fields, intimately, practically, in every season and every weather. She knew where the curlews nested in the spring and where the grouse sheltered in the winter. She knew which paths were passable after rain and which would suck your boots into the peat. She knew the names of the farms and the ruins and the outcrops of rock, Top Withens and Pondon Kirk and the waterfall at the head of the valley where the water fell 30 feet over a lip of gritstone into a pool that was so cold even in summer that putting your hand in it made your fingers ache. She knew the smell of the heather in every season, the dry, dusty, resinous smell of summer, the wet, earthy smell of autumn, the thin, cold, mineral smell of winter when the frost had hardened the peat and the streams were edged with ice. She knew the sound of the wind in the heather, which was different from the sound of the wind in the grass, which was different from the sound of the wind over bare rock, and she could tell, by the quality of the light and the direction of the wind and the way the clouds were moving, what the weather would do in the next hour, the next afternoon, the next day. Keeper went everywhere with her. He was an enormous dog, tawny and powerful, with a broad head and jaws that could crush bone, and he had a temperament to match, stubborn and aggressive and loyal to Emily, with a devotion that was absolute and that did not extend to anyone else. There is a famous story about Emily and Keeper that tells you everything you need to know about both of them. Keeper had been told not to sleep on the beds. He slept on the beds. He was told again. Emily found him on a bed, and she beat him with her fists, punching him in the face until his eyes swelled shut, and then she bathed his wounds and nursed him, and he loved her, if anything, more fiercely than before. The story is disturbing. It is also, in a strange way, clarifying. Emily did not do things by halves. She did not moderate her emotions to make them palatable. She loved fiercely and she punished fiercely, and the line between the two was, for her, not a line at all but a single, undivided force, the same force that produced Heathcliff, produced Wuthering Heights, made her walk the moors in weather that would have killed someone who did not love the landscape as intensely as she did. She also kept other animals. She had a tame hawk named Hero and a tame goose named Victoria, and she fed the wild birds that came to the parsonage garden, and the animals trusted her in a way that they did not trust anyone else, as though they recognized in her something that was closer to their own nature than to the nature of the other humans in the house. Charlotte once said that Emily was stronger than a man and simpler than a child, a description that is both inadequate and oddly precise. Emily was not simple. She was, if anything, extraordinarily complex. But her complexity was not the complexity of a person who has been shaped by the social world, by the negotiations and compromises and performances that social life requires. It was the complexity of a person who has been shaped by a landscape, by the wind and the weather and the vast impersonal forces of the natural world, and who has absorbed those forces so completely that they have become indistinguishable from her character. The parsonage where the Brontes lived sits at the top of the village of Haworth, at the end of a steep, cobbled street that climbs the hillside like a staircase. The village is built of the local stone, a dark, grey-brown gritstone that absorbs the rain and holds it so that the buildings always look damp, even on dry days, their surfaces glistening faintly as though they are sweating. The cobbles on the main street are worn smooth by centuries of feet and hoofs and cartwheels, and they are uneven, tilted at angles that make walking up the hill a matter of negotiation, each step requiring a slight adjustment of balance. Haworth, in the 1830s and 40s, was not a picturesque village. It was a working community, a place of woolcombers and weavers and small manufacturers who lived in the rows of stone cottages that climbed the hillside below the church. The Industrial Revolution had reached this part of Yorkshire, and the valleys to the south and east were full of mills, their tall chimneys belching smoke that drifted across the moors on the prevailing wind, and the sound of the looms could be heard from the parsonage. On quiet days, a low, rhythmic clatter that was the sound of the modern world encroaching on the ancient landscape of the moors. The workers in the mills worked long hours in conditions that were dangerous and unsanitary, and the children of the workers worked alongside them, small bodies bent over machinery that could crush a finger or tear off an arm in the time it took to draw a breath. The poverty was real, the suffering was real, and it was visible from the parsonage windows, the same windows that looked out on the graveyard on one side and the moors on the other, so that the Bronte children grew up with an awareness of death and suffering and beauty and wildness that was not abstract but immediate, not theoretical but visceral, a daily confrontation with the full range of human experience that most people are shielded from and that the Brontes, by accident of geography. At the top of the street, past the Black Bull pub where Branwell Bronte would drink himself to death, past the apothecary where the remedies were as likely to kill as to cure, past the sexton's house, where the man who dug the graves lived in the permanent smell of turned earth, you come to the Church of St. Michael and All Angels, a squat, solid building of blackened stone that sits on the edge of the graveyard like a ship anchored at the edge of a sea. The graveyard is enormous, far too large for the village it serves, and the reason for its size is the reason for much of what happened to the Brontes. Haworth in the first half of the 19th century was one of the most unsanitary places in England. The average life expectancy was 25 years. In a country where the national average was already shockingly low, around 40 years, Haworth was worse, a statistical outlier, a place where death came early, and came often, and came for everyone. More than 40% of children in Haworth died before the age of 6. The infant mortality rate was nearly twice the national average. The Babbage Report of 1850, a government sanitary inspection commissioned after years of epidemic disease, found that Haworth had no sewers, no drainage, no privy ash pits, and only one outdoor toilet for every 4.5 houses. The report noted that the graveyard was so full that coffins had to be placed on top of each other, and that in wet weather the overflow from the graves contaminated the wells that supplied the village with drinking water. The water supply was contaminated by the overflow from the graveyard, where the bodies were buried so close together and so close to the surface that the decomposition seeped into the soil and from the soil into the wells. The drains were open. The privies were shared. The cesspools overflowed into the streets after heavy rain, and the combination of contaminated water and inadequate sanitation created the perfect conditions for the diseases that decimated the population: typhus and cholera and dysentery, and the great slow grinding killer, tuberculosis. A government inspector who visited Haworth in 1850 reported that the sanitary conditions were among the worst he had ever seen, and recommended the immediate construction of proper drains and a clean water supply. His recommendations were implemented, but they came too late for the Brontes. The gravestones stand in rows so tight that you cannot walk between them, the inscriptions recording death after death after death, children and parents and grandparents and entire families wiped out by the diseases that thrived in the filth and the damp of the village. The stones are blackened by the same soot and rain that blackened the buildings, and many of the inscriptions are now illegible, worn away by 2 centuries of Yorkshire weather, with the names of the dead dissolving back into the stone that was meant to preserve them. The parsonage itself sits just beyond the graveyard, separated from it by a low stone wall. The Bronte children could see the graves from their windows. They could see the funerals from the upstairs rooms. They lived in the constant, intimate presence of death, not as an abstraction, but as a physical neighbor, a thing that happened on the other side of the wall, visible from the bedroom window, audible through the stone, the sound of the sexton's spade cutting into the earth, a sound as familiar to them as the sound of the wind on the moors or the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Imagine being a child in that house. Imagine waking on a winter morning to the sound of the wind and the grey light filtering through the curtains, and the knowledge, which you carry the way you carry the weight of your own body, without thinking about it, without noticing it, that the dead are out there, on the other side of the wall, inches from where you sleep. You can see their stones from your window. You know their names. Some of them are children your own age, children who were playing in the street last summer, and who are under the ground now, their eyes closed. This is not frightening, not exactly. It is simply the way things are. Death is not a stranger in Haworth. Death lives here. Death is a neighbor, a lodger, a member of the family who comes and goes without knocking, and who takes what it wants without asking. The house itself was modest. 6 rooms. The parlor, where Charlotte and Emily and Anne wrote their novels at the dining room table, walking round and round the table in the evenings, reading their work aloud to each other as they circled, their voices rising and falling in the candlelight while the wind pressed against the windows and the fire hissed in the grate. This is one of the most remarkable images in literary history. The 3 sisters circling the table like planets around a sun, each one reading from the book she was writing. The 3 stories weaving together in the air of the small room. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey taking shape simultaneously in the same house, at the same table, in the same circle of candlelight. They were each other's first audience, each other's first critics, each other's first readers, and the books they wrote bear the marks of this intimacy, this closeness, this shared creative life that was unlike anything else in the history of literature. The study was where their father, Patrick, worked on his sermons and ate his meals alone, a habit that has been much debated and that may have been eccentricity or simply the need for silence. The kitchen was the domain of Tabby Aykroyd, the servant who had been with the family for years and who cooked the plain, hearty food that sustained them, mutton stew and oat cakes and bread baked in the oven beside the fire, the smell of it filling the house and mingling with the smell of peat smoke and damp wool and the dried herbs that hung from the beams. And upstairs, the bedrooms, small and cold, the walls thin enough to hear the person in the next room breathing, or coughing, the coughing that would become, in time, the soundtrack of the Brontes' lives, the quiet, persistent, inescapable sound of tuberculosis doing its work. Patrick Bronte arrived in Haworth in 1820. He was 43 years old, an Irish-born Anglican clergyman who had risen from poverty through education and determination, working his way from a cabin in County Down to a degree at Cambridge and ordination in the Church of England. He was tall, thin, ascetic, with reddish hair that was fading to grey and a manner that was formal but not unkind. He wore a high white cravat wrapped around his neck at all times, a habit that gave him a slightly otherworldly appearance. His wife Maria had been a gentle woman from Cornwalls, small and pretty and devout, and she had given him 6 children in 7 years: Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Patrick Branwell, Emily, Jane, and Anne. The family arrived in Haworth on a cold April day, their possessions loaded onto a cart, the children walking beside it up the steep cobbled street, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The youngest, Anne, was barely a year old. The eldest, Maria, was 6. They walked past the Black Bull and the apothecary and the sexton's house and up to the parsonage, and the door opened, and they stepped inside, and the house that would contain their entire story, every joy and every sorrow, every triumph and every loss, received them. The parsonage must have felt vast to those small children, and cold, the stone walls holding the chill of an English April, the rooms smelling of damp plaster and the previous occupants' fires and the particular musty emptiness of a house that has been waiting for its new inhabitants. The children explored. They found their rooms. They pressed their faces to the windows and saw, on one side, the graveyard, with its ranks of headstones standing in the grey light like teeth in a jaw, and on the other side, the moors, stretching away into an infinity of heather and sky that must have seemed, to a 6-year-old from the south, like another planet. Maria was already ill. She had been ill for some time, the symptoms vague and shifting, a pain in her stomach, a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure, a wasting that was turning her from a healthy young woman into something thin and translucent and frightened. She was dying of cancer, though the word was not used and the disease was not understood, and she would be dead within 18 months of the family's arrival in Haworth, leaving Patrick alone with 6 children under the age of 8. The illness progressed through the summer and autumn of 1820, and into the winter and spring of 1821. Maria grew thinner, her skin took on the yellowish pallor that the disease gives its victims. She could not eat. She could not walk. She lay in the bedroom above the parlour, and the children played below her, their voices rising through the floorboards, the sounds of their games and their arguments reaching her in waves, and she must have listened to those sounds the way a sailor listens to the sea, knowing that the water that sustains you is the same water that will eventually take you under. Try to hold that in your mind for a moment. 6 children, a stone house on the edge of the moors, a graveyard pressing against the garden wall, a mother dying in a room above their heads, and a father, a man of faith and discipline, and ferocious intellect, trying to hold it all together while the wind blew and the rain fell, and the world revealed itself to be a place of extraordinary harshness and extraordinary beauty. Maria Brontë died on the 15th of September, 1821. She was 38 years old. The funeral was held at the church next door, the church that the family could see from their windows, and the body was carried across the graveyard and lowered into the vault beneath the flagstones, and the children stood in a row, the eldest holding the hand of the next eldest, and the next eldest holding the hand of the next, a chain of small, bewildered people linked together by their fingers and by the fact that the woman who had made them was gone. Some felt the children were too young to fully understand what had happened, except perhaps Maria the eldest, who was 7, and who had the particular quality of precocity and gentleness that made her, in Charlotte's memory, almost saintly. She was wrong about this, as adults often are when they remember children who died young. But the idealization tells us something about the depth of the loss. Nasira Kasalia, the daughter, became, in Charlotte's imagination, a figure of almost religious significance. The good child who was taken too soon, the innocent who suffered and died, and the grief of losing her would shape Charlotte's writing for the rest of her life. Patrick's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Branwell, came from Cornwall to help with the children. Aunt Branwell, as they called her, was a small, brisk, practical woman who wore pattens on her feet to keep them off the cold stone floors and who brought with her the habits and the accent of a warmer, softer part of England. She did not love Yorkshire. She kept to her room as much as she could, sitting by the fire with her sewing and her Methodist tracts, venturing out only when duty required it, and the children grew up aware that their aunt was there but not entirely present, a figure who occupied space in the house without quite inhabiting it. A woman who had come from somewhere else and who never stopped being from somewhere else, no matter how many years she stayed. But she stayed. She stayed for 20 years, until her own death in 1842, and she raised the Bronte children with a combination of Cornish practicality and Methodist discipline that left its mark on all of them. She taught them to sew. She supervised their prayers. She enforced the household routines that gave structure to days that might otherwise have dissolved into the formless, wind-blown emptiness of life on the edge of the moors. She was not warm, not in the way that a mother is warm, but she was reliable, and in a household where loss was a constant companion, reliability was its own form of love. The children, in those early years, were a close-knit tribe, bound together by the isolation of the parsonage and the absence of their mother and the intensity of their shared imaginative life. They had few friends outside the family. The children of the village were beneath them socially, the sons and daughters of woolcombers and weavers who spoke in the broad Yorkshire dialect that the Bronte children could imitate but did not naturally use. The children of the gentry were above them, the sons and daughters of the mill owners and the landowners who lived in the big houses on the other side of the valley, and who would not have thought of inviting the parson's children to tea. The parsonage sat in the gap between the two, too grand for the workers, and too modest for the landowners, a house that belonged, like its inhabitants, to no clear category. This isolation was formative. It pushed the children toward each other and toward the interior world of their own imaginations, with a force that might not have existed if they had lived in a larger town or a more socially integrated community. They had no one to play with but each other. They had nowhere to go but the moors. And they had nothing to do, in the long, dark evenings of a Yorkshire winter, when the wind was howling and the rain was lashing the windows and the fire was the only source of light and warmth. Nothing to do but read and write and talk and invent. And so the Bronte children turned inward. They turned to each other. And they turned to stories. It began with a box of toy soldiers. In June of 1826, Patrick brought home a set of 12 wooden soldiers for Branwell, who was 9 years old, and who greeted the gift with an enthusiasm that bordered on delirium. The children each claimed a soldier and named it, and from this simple act of naming grew one of the most extraordinary episodes of collaborative creativity in literary history. The soldiers became the inhabitants of imaginary kingdoms, Glasstown and Angria and Gondal, vast, intricate, fully realized worlds with their own geographies and histories and political systems and love affairs and wars. The children wrote the stories of these kingdoms in tiny, cramped handwriting on scraps of paper that they stitched together into miniature books, some of them no larger than a matchbox, the writing so small that it can barely be read without a magnifying glass. They wrote thousands upon thousands of words. They wrote poems and novels and plays and newspapers, all set in their imaginary worlds, all written in a handwriting that was deliberately tiny, deliberately private, a secret language that belonged only to them. Charlotte and Branwell wrote about Angria, a world of passionate love affairs and political intrigue and Byronic heroes. Emily and Anne wrote about Gondal, a wilder, more desolate world of moors and mountains and fierce, independent women who loved fiercely and died young. The writing was extraordinary, not because it was good, though some of it was remarkably good for children, but because of its sheer volume and its obsessive intensity. These were not children dabbling in storytelling. These were children who had built alternative realities, so complete and so detailed that the imaginary worlds were, in some ways, more vivid to them than the real one. They spent hours every day in Glasstown and Angria and Gondal, inventing characters and plotting their fates and arguing about the direction of the stories with a seriousness that would have been comical if it had not been so clearly necessary. The stories were what held them together. The stories were where they went when the real world, with its graves and its losses and its wind, became too much. The stories were home in a way that even the parsonage was not, because the stories were theirs, entirely theirs, a country that no one could take from them and no one could destroy. Emily's gondol was the moors. She wrote the landscape she knew into the landscape she imagined. The heather and the wind and the vast empty sky transposed into a fictional world that was, in every way that mattered, the real world seen through a different lens. The women of Gondal were fierce and proud and wild, women who rode horses across open country and fought battles and loved with an intensity that consumed them and the people they loved. They were not the meek, domestic heroines of the novels that filled the circulating libraries. They were something older and stranger, women whose passions were as elemental as the weather, women who were more like the moors than like the parlour. When Emily sat down, years later, to write Wuthering Heights, she did not need to invent a landscape or a temperament. She simply described the one she had been living with her entire life. But before we reach the novels, we must walk through the years of loss that preceded them, because it is the loss that gives the novels their weight, their gravity, the sense that runs through all of them, that love is not separate from grief but inseparable from it, that to love is to accept the possibility of losing, and that the moors, for all their beauty, are a landscape of loss, a place where the wind strips everything away and leaves only the essential, the rock beneath the heather, the bone beneath the skin. In 1824, Patrick sent his 4 eldest daughters to the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge. The school was a disaster. The building was cold, damp, and poorly ventilated, set in a low-lying area near a river that flooded regularly, the damp rising through the stone floors and settling in the children's lungs like a slow poison. The food was terrible, often burned or spoiled, and always insufficient. The children were frequently hungry, frequently cold, and frequently ill. The teachers were severe, the discipline harsh, and the atmosphere one of relentless, grinding misery that crushed the spirit while claiming to improve the character. The Bronte girls arrived at Cowan Bridge in the summer of 1824. Maria was 10, Elizabeth 9, Charlotte 8, Emily 6. They were small for their ages and already fragile, their bodies weakened by the damp of the parsonage and the inadequate nutrition that was common among the families of poorly paid clergymen. The school made them worse. The porridge was often so badly cooked that the children could not eat it, and the meat was sometimes rancid, and the bread was hard and dry, and the water came from a well, contaminated by the proximity of the graveyard. The children shivered in their beds at night, the blankets too thin to keep out the cold, and they coughed, all of them, the dry, persistent cough that was the first sign of the disease that was already living in their lungs, feeding on the damp and the cold and the hunger, growing stronger as they grew weaker. When a typhus epidemic swept through the school in the spring of 1825, it found willing victims in the weakened, malnourished bodies of the pupils. Maria and Elizabeth Brontë were sent home, both of them already dying. Maria, the eldest, the cleverest, the one who had read newspapers and talked about politics at the breakfast table, and who had been, by all accounts, a child of extraordinary precocity and gentleness, died on the 6th of May, 1825. She was 11 years old. Elizabeth died on the 15th of June, 6 weeks later. She was 10, 2 more graves in the churchyard, 2 more empty beds in the parsonage, 2 more names that would be spoken less and less frequently as the years passed, not because they were forgotten but because to speak them was to open a wound that had never fully closed, and the family learned, as all families who have lost children learn, to carry their grief silently, to walk around the empty spaces in the house the way you walk around furniture in the dark, knowing it is there, feeling its edges, never quite forgetting that the space was once occupied by something living and warm. Charlotte and Emily were withdrawn from the school immediately. They came home to the parsonage, home to the moors, home to a house that had now lost a mother and 2 sisters in the space of 4 years. Charlotte never forgot Cowan Bridge. She never forgave it. 20 years later, she would recreate the school as Lowood and Jane Eyre, and the death of Helen Burns, that gentle, patient, consumptive child who dies in Jane's arms, is widely understood to be a portrait of Maria Brontë, the sister Charlotte loved most and lost first. The scene is written with a controlled intensity that barely contains the rage beneath it, the rage of a woman who watched her sister die of neglect and who carried that anger, burning and undiminished, for the rest of her life. The 4 surviving children were educated at home. They studied with their father and their aunt and, increasingly, with each other, reading voraciously from Patrick's library, which was extensive for a country clergyman and which included Byron and Scott, and the magazines and newspapers that arrived weekly from London. The years passed. The children grew. Charlotte went away to school again, to Roe Head, where she made friends and excelled and suffered from a homesickness so intense it was almost physical. Emily went to Roe Head briefly and could not bear it. She lasted 3 months before the separation from the moors made her ill. Her face turning grey, her appetite vanishing, her body refusing to function in a place that was not home. She went back to Haworth and never willingly left again. The question of how to earn a living was a pressing one. The Bronte sisters had no money of their own, no inheritance, no prospects of marriage that they could see. Their father's stipend was modest and would die with him. The options available to educated but penniless women in early Victorian England were brutally limited. You could teach, you could governess, or you could sew. That was essentially the whole of it. 3 doors, all of them opening onto rooms that were small and cold and badly lit. Charlotte and Anne both worked as governesses, taking positions in the homes of wealthy families, living in other people's houses, caring for other people's children, occupying a strange, Siron soft tones as here was neither servant nor family, a position that required you to be present but invisible, useful but unobtrusive, educated enough to teach but not educated enough to be considered an equal. The work was lonely, poorly paid, and often humiliating, and both Charlotte and Anne wrote about it with the sharp, clear-eyed precision of people who have experienced something painful and who are determined to make the reader feel it too. Agnes Grey, Anne's first novel, is the most honest account of the governess experience in Victorian literature, a book that strips away the sentimental myth of the devoted governess and reveals the reality beneath it, the boredom and the loneliness and the casual cruelty of employers who treated their governesses as furniture. The sisters dreamed of opening a school of their own. It was the one route to financial independence that seemed feasible, the one way they could earn a living without submitting to the authority of strangers. They made plans, they wrote prospectuses, they even printed advertisements. Charlotte persuaded Aunt Branwell to fund a trip to Brussels, so that she and Emily could improve their qualifications, and off they went. In February of 1842, 2 small, fierce, terrified women travelling across the English Channel to a country where they knew no one, and spoke the language badly, driven by the same desperate determination that would later drive them to write novels and to publish them and to face the critics, and to refuse to be destroyed by rejection or by grief. This is the key to understanding Emily. She was not just a homebody or a recluse, she was a person for whom the moors were as necessary as oxygen, a person whose identity was so completely fused with a particular landscape that to remove her from it was to remove some essential part of her. The way removing a plant from its soil kills not just the roots but the whole organism. Emily on the moors was alive, electric, powerful, striding across the heather with her dog at her heels, and the wind in her hair, and an expression on her face that people who saw her described as fierce. Emily away from the moors was diminished, fading, a candle taken out of its lantern and exposed to the wind. She tried once more in Brussels. Her French teacher, Monsieur Egers, recognized her talent immediately and described her as a mind that could have been a great navigator. She wrote essays in French that were fierce, original, argumentative, full of ideas that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. But she was miserable. She missed the moors, she missed the parsonage, she missed the wind. She came home after 9 months, and she never left Yorkshire again. The school plan was abandoned. No pupils applied. The parsonage was too remote, too isolated, too far from anywhere that anyone wanted to send their children. The moors that Emily loved were to the rest of the world a deterrent. Charlotte stayed in Brussels. Charlotte fell in love with Monsieur Hagar, a married man, a love that was hopeless and consuming, and that would fuel the emotional intensity of 2 of her 4 novels. She wrote him letters after she returned to England, letters that were passionate and desperate and that Hagar's wife found and tore up. Though Charlotte later retrieved the fragments and they survive, pieced together, in the British Library. It is one of the most poignant artifacts in literary history, a love letter torn and reassembled, the words of a woman who loved a man who did not love her back, preserved by accident for the scrutiny of strangers. But that is Charlotte's story, and tonight, although we will tell Charlotte's story too, the heart of our tale is Emily, and Emily is on the moors where she belongs. The 1840s were the years of creation. The years when the novels were written, when the poems were composed, when the three Brontë sisters sat around the dining room table in the parsonage and produced, in the space of a few years, a body of work that would outlast them by centuries. It began with the poems. In the autumn of 1845, Charlotte discovered a notebook of Emily's poems. She had known that Emily wrote poetry, they all wrote poetry, but she had not known that Emily's poems were this good, this fierce, this alive with a power that Charlotte recognized immediately as genius. The poems transcended their Gondal origins. They were the poems of a woman who had found in the act of writing a way to express things that could not be expressed in any other way, the wildness and the loneliness and the ecstasy and the grief of a life lived on the edge of the world. There are lines in Emily's poems that strike the reader with the force of a physical blow. "No coward soul is mine," she wrote in what would become her most famous poem, "No trembler in the world's storm-troubled sphere." The voice is unmistakable. It is the voice of the moors, wind, the voice of a person who has spent so long in the company of elemental forces that she has become one herself. The poems are short, compressed, intense. Like the landscape they describe, every word carrying weight, every image drawn from the natural world that Emily knew with the intimacy of a lover. Another poem, often called The Prisoner, describes a visionary experience of such power and such strangeness that it reads less like Victorian poetry and more like mystical testimony, the account of a person who has been somewhere that language cannot quite reach and who is trying, with fierce concentration, to bring back what she found there. At times, Emily was furious when she discovered that Charlotte had read her poems. She regarded the intrusion as a violation, a trespass into the private territory of her mind, and she did not forgive easily. The rage was real. Emily's privacy was not a preference but a principle, a fundamental aspect of her character that she defended with the same ferocity that Keeper defended his territory, by baring her teeth and refusing to back down. But Charlotte was persistent, and she was right. The poems deserved to be published. Anne quietly produced her own poems, which were gentler than Emily's but equally accomplished, and after days of argument and negotiation, the three sisters agreed to publish a joint volume. They chose pseudonyms that preserved their initials but disguised their sex. Charlotte became Currer Bell, Emily became Ellis Bell, Anne became Acton Bell. The choice was deliberate and strategic. They knew that the Victorian literary world would not take women seriously, that a book by a woman would be reviewed with condescension at best and contempt at worst, that the critics who praised a man's fierce intelligence would call the same quality in a woman unwomanly or coarse. They did not want to be dismissed. They wanted to be read. The poems were published in May of 1846 at the sisters' own expense. The cost was just over £31, a significant sum for three women with almost no income, paid from a small legacy that Aunt Branwell had left them when she died in 1842. The publisher was Aylott and Jones of Paternoster Row in London, a firm that specialized in religious texts and that took on the poetry volume as a sideline. The book sold 2 copies. In the entire first year of its publication, the failure was complete, crushing and entirely predictable. Poetry did not sell. The Brontes were unknown. The publisher was obscure. The book sank without a trace, and the unsold copies sat in a warehouse in London, gathering dust, while the 3 women who had written them sat in a parsonage in Yorkshire writing novels. But the sisters were already working on something else. They were writing novels. Charlotte was writing The Professor, a quiet, autobiographical novel based on her Brussels experience. It was a controlled, restrained book. The book of a woman who was holding herself in check, who was writing from experience but who was afraid to let the experience overwhelm the art. It would be rejected 9 times, and the rejections would teach Charlotte something important about herself and about her writing, which was that restraint was not her gift. Her gift was passion, intensity, the full-throated cry of a woman who has been silent for too long, and who will not be silent any longer. She would learn this lesson, and the result would be Jane Eyre. Anne was writing Agnes Grey, a novel about a governess drawn from her own years of service in the houses of the Yorkshire gentry. Anne had worked as a governess for the Ingham family at Blake Hall, where she was dismissed after less than a year because the children were so badly behaved that she could not control them, and then for the Robinson family at Thorpe Green Hall near York, where she stayed for 5 years, and where she witnessed, with quiet, observant horror, the affair between Branwell and Mrs. Robinson that would destroy her brother. The experience had been painful in ways that were both predictable and surprising. She had expected the loneliness, Agnes Grey is the most autobiographical of the Bronte novels, and the most quietly angry. It does not shout, it does not rage. It simply describes in clear, precise prose what it is like to be a woman of intelligence and sensitivity trapped in a position that denies her both. And Emily was writing Wuthering Heights. Picture her at the dining room table. The candle throws a circle of yellow light that reaches to the edges of the table and no further, so that Emily is sitting in an island of light in a dark room, and beyond the circle the shadows press in, and beyond the shadows the windows are black with the night, and beyond the windows the moors are out there, invisible but present, breathing. She writes in a small, tight hand, the pen moving quickly across the paper, the words coming in a rush, as though the story already exists somewhere, and she is simply the instrument through which it is passing from one world into another. The fire is dying in the grate. Keeper lies at her feet. Charlotte is writing at the other end of the table. Anne is writing beside her. The three pens scratch across the paper in a rhythm that is almost musical, three voices composing simultaneously, three stories taking shape in the same circle of candlelight. And outside the window, the wind blows and the moors breathe and the graves in the churchyard hold their silence. She is writing about the moors. She is writing about Catherine Earnshaw, a girl as wild as the heather, who loves Heathcliff with a passion that is not romantic in any conventional sense, but elemental, geological, a love that is part of the bedrock of the world. I am Heathcliff, Catherine says, and the statement is not a metaphor. It is a statement of identity, of fusion, of two people who are so completely merged that the boundaries between them have dissolved. The love in Wuthering Heights is not the gentle, courteous love of Jane Austen's novels. It is not the love of drawing rooms and dance cards and proposals made on bended knee. It is the love of the moors, a love that is fierce and possessive and destructive and that does not end with death but continues beyond it. The ghost of Catherine haunting Heathcliff for 20 years, scratching at the window, calling his name. The dead reaching for the living across a barrier that is not strong enough to keep them apart. Emily knew about ghosts. She had grown up in a house next to a graveyard. She had lost her mother and two sisters before she was 7 years old. She knew what it was to hear the wind at night, and to wonder whether the sound was the wind or something else. Something that wanted to come in, something that had been shut out and could not rest. The ghosts in Wuthering Heights are not Gothic decorations. They are the ghosts of Emily's own experience. The dead who refused to stay dead, the loved ones who lingered in the rooms where they had lived and the landscapes where they had walked. But Wuthering Heights is not only about love and death. It is about the moors themselves, about the way a landscape enters the people who live in it and becomes indistinguishable from their character. The moors in the novel are not a backdrop. They are a presence, a force, a character as real and as vivid as Heathcliff or Catherine. The wind that blows through the novel is the same wind that blew through the parsonage. The heather that covers the hills is the same heather Emily walked through every day. The streams and the rocks and the sky are the same streams and rocks and sky that she knew by heart. The novel opens with a scene that is, in its way, as famous as anything Shakespeare ever wrote. Lockwood, a visitor from the south, a man of cities and drawing rooms and polite conversation, is staying at Wuthering Heights on a wild winter night. He falls asleep and dreams that the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw is at the window, scratching at the glass trying to get in. "Let me in," she cries. "I've been a waif for 20 years. Emily knew about that kind of longing. She had felt it every time she was taken away from the moors. The desperate, homesick, almost physical need to be back in the landscape that was her home and her soul. And she had felt it in a different way every time she walked past the graves in the churchyard, and thought of her mother and her sisters, the dead who were so close, just on the other side of the wall, just beneath the grass, close enough to touch if the earth were not in the way. There is a passage where Catherine says that her love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight but necessary. This is the moors. This is the bedrock. This is the thing that remains when everything else has been stripped away by the wind, the love that is not pretty or comfortable or easy, but that is permanent, that is woven into the structure of the earth itself. And there is another passage, perhaps the most famous in the novel, where Catherine says that whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. This is not a love declaration. It is a statement about the nature of existence, about the possibility that two people can be so fundamentally connected that the connection precedes them, outlasts them, and exists independently of them, the way the moors exist independently of the people who walk across them. Emily finished Wuthering Heights in 1846. She was 28 years old. She had written one of the greatest novels in the English language, and she had done it in a small stone house at the edge of the moors, in a parish where the average life expectancy was 25 years, in a family that had already lost 3 of its members and that was about to lose 3 more. And she had done it without any of the advantages that the literary world considered necessary, without a university education, without connections, without travel, without experience of the wider world. She had nothing but the moors and her family and her own ferocious, ungovernable talent. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The novels were finished and sent to publishers. Charlotte's The Professor was rejected. It would be rejected 9 times in all, each rejection arriving at the parsonage in a brown paper parcel that Charlotte opened with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the accumulated weight of hope and disappointment that every writer carries, and that never gets lighter, no matter how many times you carry it. But Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were accepted by Thomas Cotley Newby, a London publisher of no particular distinction and considerable unreliability, who agreed to publish both novels together in a 3-volume edition. Meanwhile, Charlotte had begun a new novel. She had taken the rejection of The Professor and she had used it, the way she used everything, as fuel. She sat at the dining room table and she wrote Jane Eyre in a white heat of creative energy, the story pouring out of her with a speed and a fluency that she had not experienced before, the words coming not from her head but from some deeper place. The place where Cowan Bridge was still burning and Maria was still dying and Charlotte herself was still the small, plain, fierce, brilliant woman who had been told all her life that she was not pretty enough and not rich enough and not important enough, and who had decided with a stubbornness that matched Emily's in its intensity, if not in its wildness, that she would make herself important through the sheer force of her talent and her will. Jane Eyre was published in October of 1847 by Smith, Elder and Company, and it was an immediate sensation. The critics loved it, the public loved it. It was the kind of success that changes a writer's life overnight, that turns an unknown person into a name that everyone recognizes, a voice that everyone wants to hear. Charlotte, hidden behind the pseudonym Currer Bell, was suddenly the most talked about author in England. The books by Ellis and Acton Bell were published 2 months later, in December. The contrast between Jane Eyre's reception and the reception of Wuthering Heights could not have been starker. Jane Eyre was loved. Wuthering Heights was not loved. It was admired and reviled and puzzled over and condemned, often in the same review. The critics did not know what to make of it. They had never read anything like it. The violence of the emotions, the darkness of the characters, the refusal to provide the moral framework that Victorian readers expected, the absence of a conventional hero or a conventional love story or a conventional ending, all of this was deeply unsettling to readers who had been raised on the polite, well-mannered novels of the circulating libraries. One reviewer called it wild, confused, disjointed, and improbable. Another said the reader would be disgusted by details of cruelty, inhumanity, and the most diabolical hate and vengeance. They did not understand that they were reading a masterpiece. They did not understand that the book they were condemning would be read and studied and loved long after their reviews had crumbled to dust. History would correct them, but history would be too late for Emily. Emily said nothing. She walked the moors. She cared for her animals. She sat at the table in the evenings and wrote, or listened to Charlotte and Anne discussing the reviews. Emily did not seem to care. Or if she cared, she did not show it. And with Emily, the two things may have been the same. She had written the book she needed to write. She had put the moors on paper. She had given Heathcliff and Catherine to the world. What the world did with them was the world's business, not hers. The secret of the Bell brothers' identities was eventually revealed, and the revelation that the authors were women and sisters caused a sensation. Charlotte and Anne traveled to London to prove their existence to their publishers, appearing at the offices of Smith, Elder and Company, and announcing, with a mixture of nervousness and defiance, that they were Currer and Acton Bell. The publishers were astonished. Emily refused to go. She would not perform. She would not display herself. She would not stand in a drawing room in London and submit to the inspection of men who had read her book and thought they knew something about her because of it. The moors were the moors. Emily was Emily, and she was not for sale. Anne, meanwhile, had published her second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, in June of 1848. It sold so well that it went into a second edition within 6 weeks, outselling both Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. Was a brave, unflinching account of a woman who leaves her alcoholic husband and supports herself and her child through her own work as a painter, a plot that was radical in 1848, when a married woman had almost no legal rights to her own property, her own earnings, or her own children. The novel drew directly from Anne's observation of Branwell's decline, and it was more controversial in its way than Wuthering Heights because it challenged the Victorian assumption that a wife's duty was to submit to her husband, regardless of his behavior. Anne was the quietest of the three sisters, the one most easily overlooked, but she was, in her own way, her fierceness is expressed not in wildness but in a moral clarity that cut through the evasions and the hypocrisies of her age like a blade through silk. She deserves more attention than history has given her. She was not the least of the Brontes. She was the bravest, and then the dying began, tuberculosis. The word itself sounds like what it does, a slow, wet, grinding destruction that begins in the lungs and spreads, over weeks and months and sometimes years, through the body, consuming the tissue, consuming the strength, consuming the life of the person it inhabits. The Victorians called it consumption, which was more honest, because that is what the disease does. It consumes. It eats the body from the inside, the way fire eats wood, steadily and thoroughly, leaving behind something that is the same shape as what was there before, but that is hollow, empty ash. Tuberculosis was the great killer of the 19th century. It killed more people in England than any other disease, more than cholera, more than typhus, more than smallpox. It killed the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, but it had a particular affinity for the young, for the talented, for the beautiful, for the people whose deaths would be most keenly felt, as though the disease had a taste for irony. Keats died of it at 25, Chopin died of it at 39, the Brontes died of it one after another like dominoes falling in a row. The disease was spread by coughing, by the tiny droplets of moisture that a consumptive exhaled with every breath and that hung in the air of poorly ventilated rooms like invisible seeds, waiting to be inhaled by the next person who walked through the door. The rooms were small and close, the ceilings low, the windows often shuttered against the wind, and the family lived in intimate proximity, sharing meals, sharing rooms, sharing the same close, warm, stale air that the tuberculosis bacillus loved. If one person in the household was infected, the others were almost certain to follow. The disease moved through families the way it moved through the slums of the industrial cities, silently, patiently, one breath at a time. The first symptom was usually a cough, a dry, persistent cough that would not go away, that lingered through the winter and into the spring, and that the sufferer dismissed as a cold, as the damp, as the inevitable consequence of living in a stone house on a hilltop in Yorkshire. Then the cough became productive, bringing up phlegm that was first white, and then yellow, and then in the later stages, streaked with blood. Then the weight loss, the wasting, the slow, visible diminution of the body, the clothes hanging looser, the face growing thinner, the eyes growing larger and brighter as the flesh around them receded. Then the fevers, the night sweats, the sheets soaked through by morning, the body burning with a heat that came from inside and that no amount of cool water or fresh air could quench. And then, at the end, the hemorrhage, the sudden, catastrophic bleeding from the lungs that was often the final event, the blood coming up in a rush, bright red and frothy, filling the mouth and the throat and the handkerchief and the sheets, and the person drowning in their own blood, and the room falling silent, and the wind outside continuing to blow. It began with Branwell, Patrick Branwell Bronte, the only son, the one on whom the family's hopes had been pinned, the one who was supposed to have been the genius. This is one of the saddest threads in the Bronte story, the slow unraveling of a young man who had been given every advantage his family could afford, and who had failed spectacularly and comprehensively at everything he tried. Branwell had been the golden child. He was clever and charming and articulate, a gifted painter who had studied under the portraitist William Robinson in Leeds, and a capable writer whose contributions to the Angria Chronicles were as inventive and as prolific as Charlotte's. Patrick had invested in him the hopes and the resources that the family could not afford to invest in the girls. He was tutored at home while his sisters were sent to schools. He was encouraged to believe that a brilliant career awaited him, in art or in literature, or in whatever field his restless, mercurial talent chose to pursue. He was, in the parlance of the time, the one who would make something of himself, and the Bronte women, brilliant as they were, were expected to make do with the limited options available to unmarried daughters of impoverished clergymen, teaching, governessing, or the quiet, invisible labor of keeping house. But Branwell could not do it. He went to London to enroll at the Royal Academy of Art, and he never enrolled. The story of what happened is unclear. Perhaps he was rejected. Perhaps he lost his nerve. Perhaps he simply spent the money on drink and came home with nothing to show for it, but a hangover and a lie. He tried to earn a living as a portrait painter and failed. He took a position as a private tutor and was dismissed. He worked briefly as a railway clerk and was dismissed for negligence. He came home to Haworth broken. He drank, but took laudanum. He ran up debts at the Black Bull that the family could not afford to pay. He set his bed on fire one night, passed out from drink, and would have burned to death if Emily had not smelled the smoke and dragged him out. He raved and wept and threatened and pleaded, and the household absorbed his chaos, the way a sponge absorbs water, silently, patiently, with a weariness that grew heavier every day. The sisters wrote their novels while Branwell was drinking himself to death in the next room. Think about that. Charlotte was writing Jane Eyre, that fierce, triumphant declaration of a woman's right to independence and self-respect, while her brother was stumbling through the hallway in a laudanum haze, knocking into the furniture, calling out for a woman who may or may not have loved him, and who had certainly abandoned him. Emily was writing Wuthering Heights, that savage hymn to the power of love and the wildness of the moors, while the smell of Branwell's whiskey drifted under the study door and the sound of his weeping came through the bedroom wall. Anne was writing The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, that unflinching portrait of alcoholism and its effects on a family, drawing directly and obviously from the disaster unfolding in front of her eyes. Branwell died on the 24th of September, 1848. He was 31 years old. He died standing up because he had told his father that he wanted to die on his feet, a gesture that was either brave or theatrical or both. Patrick held him as he died. The old man, who had now lost his wife, 2 daughters and a son, knelt beside the body and prayed, and the prayers rose through the house and out through the roof and into the sky above the moors, where the wind took them and scattered them across the heather like seeds. Emily caught cold at Branwell's funeral. Or perhaps she was already ill and the funeral merely hastened what was coming, the tuberculosis that had been living in her lungs for months biding its time. Emily had been coughing for weeks. She had lost weight. Her face had taken on the particular transparency that tuberculosis gives its victims, the skin thinning until the bones beneath are visible, the eyes growing larger and brighter as the face around them shrinks. She refused to see a doctor. She refused all medicine. She refused to acknowledge that she was ill. This was not denial. This was Emily. She had lived her entire life on her own terms, with a ferocity of independence that the people around her found both admirable and infuriating, and she would die the same way. She got up every morning and dressed herself and came downstairs and sat by the fire. She tried to feed her dogs. She tried to sew. She tried to do the things she had always done, the small, ordinary things that constitute a life, and each day she could do a little less. And each day the cough was a little worse. Family watched her diminish and could do nothing because Emily would not let them fart. Sinasira. The house smelled different now. It smelled of illness, that particular smell that sick rooms have, the smell of sweat and medicine, and the faintly sweet, faintly rotten undertone that is the smell of a body consuming itself. Emily's shawl hung on the back of her chair, and Keeper lay beneath it, his muzzle between his paws, his brown eyes following Emily's every movement, with the devoted uncomprehending attention of an animal that knows something is wrong but cannot understand what. The fire burned constantly in the grate, because Emily was always cold now, the cold that comes from inside, from the core, the cold that no amount of warmth can reach. The windows were kept closed against the December wind, and the room grew stuffy and close, the air heavy with the smell of peat smoke, and the sound of Emily's breathing, which was becoming day by day more labored, more ragged, more audible, as though the lungs that had once filled themselves with the wild, clean air of the moors were now struggling to process even the stale, warm air of the parlor. Charlotte wrote letters during these weeks that are among the most painful documents in English literature. She described watching Emily walk from the fireside to the window, a distance of perhaps 6 feet, and needing to stop halfway to catch her breath, her face grey, her lips blue, her hands gripping the back of a chair, while the cough shook her body. She described the sound of Emily's breathing at night, audible through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms, a harsh, labored, rattling sound that was the sound of lungs filling with fluid, the sound of a body drowning from the inside. She described the look in Emily's eyes, a look that Charlotte recognized as the same fierce, stubborn, unyielding look that Emily had always had, the look of a woman who would not submit, who would go down fighting even if the fight was against her own body and the outcome was never in doubt. On the morning of the 19th of December 1848, Emily got dressed and came downstairs for the last time. The morning was cold. The kind of cold that seeps through stone walls and settles in the joints and makes the fingers stiff and clumsy. Emily sat on the sofa in the parlor. She tried to pick up her needlework. Her hands were shaking too badly to hold the needle. The comb she had been using to fix her hair fell into the fire, and a servant retrieved it, and Emily tried again to comb her hair and could not. The small defeat of the calm was, in a way, the thing that broke her. The moment when the body's refusal to cooperate could no longer be interpreted as anything other than what it was. At around noon, she whispered to Charlotte that she would see a doctor now, if one could be sent for. It was too late. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Emily Brontë died. She was 30 years old. Outside, the moors stretched away to the horizon, brown and grey under the December sky. The wind blew. The heather was dormant, its flowers long gone, the stems dark and brittle against the peat. The streams ran cold and clear over the gritstone. A curlew called, somewhere out on the moor, its cry carrying across the empty landscape like a question to which there was no answer. The moors did not stop. The wind did not stop. The landscape that had made Emily and that Emily had made immortal in Wuthering Heights continued exactly as it had always been, vast and empty and beautiful and indifferent. Keeper, Emily's dog, walked in the funeral procession. He lay outside her bedroom door for weeks afterward, whimpering. The sound of it drifted through the parsonage, room by room, as persistent and as heartbreaking as the wind. Anne was next. She had been ill before Emily died, the same cough, the same wasting, the same transparent skin, but she had hidden it because Emily was dying and there was no room in the house for two tragedies at once. After Emily's death, Anne's illness could no longer be concealed. She was declining rapidly. Anne wanted to see the sea. She had always loved the sea. She had been happy at Scarborough, on the Yorkshire coast, where she had spent time as a governess, and she asked with the quiet, polite determination that was characteristic of her, if she might be taken there one last time. Charlotte took her. Ellen Nussey, Charlotte's dearest friend, came too, and the three women travelled to Scarborough in late May of 1849, the carriage jolting over the roads while Anne sat propped against the cushions and looked out the window at the countryside passing by. The journey took them east, away from the moors, through the Vale of York, through farmland that was flat and green and orderly, a landscape that was the opposite of the moors in every way, tidy and cultivated and domestic, the hedgerows clipped, the fields ploughed in straight lines, the farmhouses solid and prosperous, with smoke rising from their chimneys into a sky that was wider here, without the hills to frame it, a sky that seemed to expand as they travelled, opening up like a book, the pages of it stretching to the horizon on every side. And then the sea. The first glimpse of it, a thin blue line between the hills, widening as the road descended toward the coast, the air changing, the smell changing, the cold, peaty, heather-scented air of the moors giving way to something lighter, brighter, saltier, the smell of the sea, that ancient, primal smell that is unlike any other smell in the world, the smell of salt and seaweed and the particular freshness of air that has been washed by waves. Anne must have felt it. She must have sat up straighter in the carriage, or turned her face toward the window, or closed her eyes and breathed it in, the sea air, the last clean air she would ever breathe. They arrived in Scarborough and took rooms at a lodging house with a view of the bay. The bay was beautiful, a wide curving sweep of sand with the castle on the headland above it, and the sea stretching away to the horizon, the waves breaking on the shore with a sound that was not like the sound of the wind on the moors, not that low, sustained moan, but something more rhythmic, more regular, a pulse, a heartbeat, the slow visible, steady breathing of something vast and patient. Anne sat by the window and looked at the sea. She had loved this view. She had loved the way the light changed on the water, the way the clouds moved across the sky, the way the gulls wheeled and cried above the waves. She had loved the sense of space, the sense of possibility, the sense that the world was larger than the parsonage and the graveyard and the moors, that there was something beyond the horizons, something she would never see but that was there, waiting. Real Brontë died at Scarborough on the 28th of May, 1849. She was 29 years old. She died quietly, as she had lived, without drama, without fuss, with the gentle, patient courage that had been her defining quality. Her last words, spoken to Charlotte, were "Take courage." 2 words, the smallest possible gift, and the most generous. She was buried there in the churchyard of St. Mary's overlooking the sea, because Charlotte could not bear the thought of another funeral at Haworth, another procession through the graveyard, another grave dug in the earth beside the parsonage. Anne lies at Scarborough still, the only Bronte not buried at Haworth, the only one who escaped, in death if not in life, the gravitational pull of the moors. She lies on the headland above the bay, and the sea is always there, always moving, always breathing, and the gulls still cry above the waves, and the light still changes on the water, and the wind that blows across the churchyard carries the smell of salt and the sound of the surf, and if you listen carefully, the echo of 2 words spoken by a dying woman to her sister on a May afternoon in 1849. Take courage. Take courage. Charlotte was alone. In the space of 9 months, she had lost her brother and both her sisters. She was 33 years old. She was the most famous novelist in England, and she was standing in the parsonage at Haworth with her 72-year-old father, and the servants, and the silence, and the wind, and the house that had once been full of voices and stories and the scratch of pens on paper was now so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece was the loudest sound in the room. The loneliness was physical. It was not just an emotion but a condition, a state of being that affected her body as much as her mind. She could not sleep. She could not eat. She walked through the rooms of the parsonage, and every room reminded her of someone who was gone. The parlour, where they had circled the table. The kitchen, where Emily had kneaded bread with the same fierce concentration she brought to everything she did. The upstairs corridor, where the sound of breathing through the thin walls had been replaced by silence. Charlotte would sit at the dining room table in the evenings, in the chair she had always sat in, and she would look at the empty chairs around her. Emily's chair and Anne's chair and Branwell's chair, and the emptiness of those chairs was louder than any sound she had ever heard. She walked the moors. She walked the paths that Emily had walked, the paths that led up onto the hilltops and across the heather to top Withens and the waterfall, and the places where the 4 of them had played as children, the places where the imaginary kingdoms of Angria and Gondel had been born. The moors looked the same. The heather bloomed in August, purple and gold, and the streams ran clear and cold over the gritstone, and the wind blew with the same persistent, impersonal force it had always blown, and Emily was not there. Emily would never be there again, and the moors, which had been Emily's place, Emily's church, Emily's entire world, went on without her, indifferent, beautiful, unchanged. She wrote to her publisher. At that hour, we used to assemble in the dining room, she said. We used to talk. Now I sit by myself. I cannot help thinking of their last days, remembering their sufferings, and what they said and did, and how they looked in mortal affliction. She wrote to her friend Ellen Nurses. I do not know how life will pass, she said, but I certainly do feel confidence in him who has upheld me hitherto. The confidence was real. Charlotte's faith was a genuine source of strength, not a performance but a deep, quiet conviction that the God who had taken her sisters from her had not abandoned her, that there was a purpose in the suffering even if she could not see it. But faith does not cure loneliness. Faith does not fill empty chairs. Faith does not replace the sound of Emily's voice reading her poems aloud, or the sight of Anne's gentle face bent over her needlework, or the smell of Branwell's tobacco drifting down the stairs. The evenings were the worst. The long, dark, winter evenings when the wind howled and the fire crackled and the clock ticked and there was no one to talk to, no one to walk around the table with. Charlotte developed a habit of pacing the room alone, walking the same circuit that the 3 sisters had walked together, round and round the dining room table, but alone now, her footsteps the only sound, her shadow the only company, the candle throwing her silhouette against the wall in a shape that was, depending on the angle, almost indistinguishable from the shape of a woman walking beside her. She walked, and she thought, and she remembered, and the memories were so vivid and so painful, the way you wait for a wave to pass when you are standing in the sea, bracing yourself, holding your breath, knowing that the water will recede, and that you will still be standing when it does. She continued to visit the moors, but the visits were different now. The moors, which had been Emily's place, Emily's kingdom, Emily's entire world, were haunted. Not by ghosts, not in the literal sense, but by the memory of Emily walking beside her. Emily striding ahead with Keeper at her heels, Emily standing on a hilltop with her face turned into the wind, and her eyes closed, and an expression of such fierce, concentrated joy that Charlotte had sometimes felt. Watching her, that she was seeing something private, something sacred, something that was not meant for anyone else's eyes. The heaven was the same, the Zabunba was the same. But Emily was not there, and the moors without Emily were like a cathedral without a congregation, beautiful and empty, and echoing with the memory of what they had once contained. Charlotte also had to contend with the literary world, which had discovered the identity of Currer Bell, and which now wanted to claim her. She was invited to London. She was introduced to Thackeray and to other literary luminaries. She attended dinners and parties and literary gatherings where she stood in corners, small and plain and acutely uncomfortable, watching the confident, well-dressed, well-connected people of London society with the same sharp, observant eye that she brought to everything, an eye that missed nothing and forgave little. She was famous. She was celebrated. She was one of the most talked about women in England. And she was desperately, achingly lonely because fame is not company, and celebrity is not love, and all the dinner invitations in London could not replace the sound of two women walking around a dining room table in a parsonage on the edge of the moors, reading their novels aloud to each other, by candlelight while the wind blew and the fire died and the night closed in around them like a hand. She wrote Shirley, she wrote Villette. She wrote with the same discipline that had always characterized her work, but the books were lonelier now. The heroines were more isolated. The endings were more ambiguous. The joy that had flashed through Jane Eyre like lightning through a storm was muted, replaced by something more somber, more measured, more aware of the cost of living. Villette, her last completed novel, is the loneliest book Charlotte ever wrote, the story of a woman stranded in a foreign city, surrounded by strangers, sustained by nothing but her own will and her own intelligence. And the stubborn refusal to surrender that was, in the end, the defining quality of all the Bronte women. In 1854, Charlotte married Arthur Bell Nicholls, her father's curate, a quiet, steady, unremarkable man who had loved her for years. The marriage surprised everyone. Charlotte had spent her entire adult life insisting that she would rather be alone than settle for a man she did not passionately love, and Nicholls was not a passionate man. He was solid, dependable, loyal, the kind of man who would never set the world on fire but who would never let the fire go out, either. Patrick opposed the marriage initially, believing that Nicholls was beneath his daughter, but Charlotte, who had faced down publishers and critics, and the entire literary establishment of Victorian England, was not going to be deterred by her father's disapproval. She married Nicholls in June of 1854, in the church next to the parsonage, the same church where she had attended services every Sunday of her life, the same church under which her mother and her sisters lay. She wore a white dress and a bonnet trimmed with green, and she walked to the church on the arm of an old friend, because her father refused to attend. Patrick changed his mind at the last moment and appeared at the church door, but the hurt of his initial refusal left a mark that did not fade. The marriage was happy. Charlotte, who had expected so little, found in Nicholls a companionship and a warmth that surprised her. She wrote to Ellen Nussey that she had found a calm, measured satisfaction in her marriage that was different from the passionate love she had imagined in her youth, but that was, in its own way, real. She described the pleasure of having someone to talk to in the evenings, someone whose presence in the house was not an absence but a comfort, someone who cared about her, and who showed that caring in the small, daily, unspectacular ways that matter most. A cup of tea brought to her desk, a fire built up without being asked, a hand on her shoulder as he passed her chair. After years of loneliness, after years of empty chairs and silent rooms and the ticking of the clock, the simple fact of another person's presence was a gift that Charlotte had not known she needed until she received it. She became pregnant almost immediately. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Charlotte was 38, small and thin and never robust, and the physical demands of pregnancy overwhelmed her fragile body. She was nauseous constantly, unable to eat, unable to keep down what little food she managed to swallow. She grew thin and pale and weak, the wasting accelerating week by week, her body consuming itself in the effort to sustain the new life that was growing inside her. The doctors could not explain what was happening. They could not stop it. Charlotte died on the 31st of March, 1855, 3 weeks before her 39th birthday. The cause of death was recorded as phthisis, tuberculosis, though modern scholars have suggested that the immediate cause may have been hyperemesis gravidarum, the severe and uncontrollable nausea of pregnancy, or some combination of the two. She died in the bedroom above the parlor, the same bedroom where her mother had died 34 years earlier. In the same house, under the same roof, with the same wind blowing against the same windows and the same graveyard pressing against the same wall. She was buried at Haworth, in the vault beneath the church, near her mother and her sisters Maria and Elizabeth and her brother Branwell and her sister Emily. Anne was the only one missing, the only one who lay elsewhere, by the sea, under a sky that was wider and bluer and gentler than the sky over the moors. Charlotte's unborn child died with her. The baby that might have been a continuation, a new beginning, a life that carried something of the Brontes forward into the future, died before it drew its first breath, and the line ended, and the parsonage grew quieter still. Patrick Brontë lived on. He lived for 6 more years, dying in 1861 at the age of 84, having outlived his wife and all 6 of his children. Think about that. 84 years old. Every child dead. Every child. The house that had once rung with the voices of 6 children, with the stories and the arguments and the laughter and the scratch of pens on paper, was silent. Patrick ate his meals alone in his study, as he had always done, but the solitude that had once been a choice was now a sentence. He walked in the garden that backed onto the graveyard where 5 of his children lay, and he looked at the moors which were the same moors they had always been, the heather blooming in August and dying in October and the wind blowing and the streams running and the sky changing from blue to grey to the colour of hammered pewter, and none of it caring, none of it noticing, none of it aware that the people who had loved this landscape most, made it famous, the people who had transformed it into literature that would be read for centuries, were under the ground now, silent, still, gone. He kept the tiny manuscripts, he kept the miniature books that the children had made, the secret kingdoms of Glasstown and Angria and Gondal, written in handwriting so small that you needed a magnifying glass to read it. He kept Emily's desk and Charlotte's letters and Anne's drawings. He kept everything because everything was all he had left, and because to throw any of it away would have been to admit that the people who had made it, for all his certainty that his children were with God, could not bring himself to do that. Not yet. Not while the ink was still legible and the paper still held the shape of the hands that had folded it. Elizabeth Gaskell came to Haworth in 1853 to write Charlotte's biography, and the book she produced, The Life of Charlotte Brontë, published in 1857, is one of the great literary biographies, a vivid, passionate, sometimes inaccurate account of a family and a place that Gaskell found both fascinating and appalling. She described the village, the steep cobbled street, the graveyard, the parsonage, the moors. She described Patrick as an eccentric, a man who fired pistols out of the back door, and who burned the children's coloured shoes because he disapproved of vanity. Some of this was true, some of it was exaggerated, all of it contributed to the myth, the powerful, persistent, not entirely inaccurate myth of the Brontes as a family of geniuses living in splendid tragic isolation on the edge of the wild Yorkshire moors. If you go to Haworth today, you can walk up the cobbled street to the parsonage. It is a museum now, carefully preserved, the rooms furnished as they were in the Brontes' time, the dining room table still in the parlour, the sofa where Emily died still against the wall, the clock still ticking, the only sound in the house when the tourists are gone and the silence settles in like snow. You can see the miniature books in their glass cases, the tiny handwriting blurred by time but still legible, still carrying the stories that 4 children invented in a house at the edge of the world. You can see the portrait that Branwell painted of his 3 sisters, the famous group portrait in which Branwell painted himself out, leaving a pale, ghostly pillar between Charlotte and Emily where his own figure once stood, a self-erasure that is as eloquent and as sad as anything in the novels. You can walk out the back door and through the gate in the wall and onto the moors. The path leads away from the village and up onto the hilltops, the houses falling behind you, the sounds of the village fading, the wind picking up as you climb until there is nothing around you but the heather and the sky and the sound of your own breathing, and the breathing of the moors. The path is the same path that Emily walked. The wind is the same wind. The sky is the same sky that she looked up at every day of her life. the sky that was, for her, as essential as food or water, the sky that she carried inside her and that she poured, without reservation and without apologies, into the pages of the most extraordinary novel ever written by a person who never left home. Well, if you walk far enough, you come to a place called Topwithens, a ruined farmhouse on a hilltop that is sometimes identified as the original Wuthering Heights. The identification is almost certainly wrong, but the location is right. The wildness of it, the exposure, the sense of being at the top of the world with nothing between you and the sky. The walls are still standing, grey stone blackened by weather, the windows empty, the roof gone, the rooms open to the sky and the rain and the wind that blows through them with the same sound it has always made. The walk to Topwithens takes about an hour from the parsonage, longer if you stop to look at the view, which you will, because the view is extraordinary. The moors stretch away in every direction, purple in summer, brown in winter, a landscape that looks from a distance like the surface of the sea, undulating. The sky above the moors is enormous, bigger than any sky you have seen before, because there is nothing to interrupt it, no buildings, no trees, no hills high enough to break the line of the horizon. It is just sky from edge to edge, and the clouds move across it with a speed and a freedom that makes you feel, for a moment, as though you are the one who is standing still, and the whole world is moving around you. The path crosses a stream on stepping stones that are slippery with moss, and then climbs through a field of rushes that whisper and hiss in the wind, and then levels out on the moor top, and suddenly you are in it, in the landscape, surrounded by it on every side. The heather brushing against your legs, the peat soft and springy under your feet, the wind in your face, the sky above you, and the silence, the extraordinary, ringing silence of a place where the only sounds are natural sounds. The wind and the water and the cry of a bird and the beating of your own heart. Emily walked here. She walked here with Keeper at her side, and the wind in her hair, and the heather brushing against her skirts and the sky above her so wide and so deep that it made the parsonage, and the village, and the graveyard, and all the small, sad, human things that happened there seem very far away and very small. She walked here and she carried the landscape inside her, and she sat down at a table in a small stone house, and she wrote it all down, the wind and the heather and the love and the grief and the ghosts. And the book she wrote has been read by millions of people in every country on earth, and every one of them has felt, for as long as they were reading, the wind on their face and the heather under their feet, and the vast, wild, heartbreaking beauty of a landscape that is indifferent to human suffering, and that is, for that very reason, the most honest and the most consoling thing in the world. There is a plaque on the wall at Topwithens that reads, in English and Japanese, because the Japanese love the Brontes with a devotion that is both touching and entirely understandable, that the farmhouse has been associated with Wuthering Heights, but that the building bears no resemblance to the one described in the novel. This is true. The ruined farmhouse is modest, a simple two-story structure that would have housed a farmer and his family, and his animals under the same roof. The house in the novel is something else, a dark, brooding, windswept mansion that is as much a character as the people who inhabit it. But the landscape is right. The landscape is exactly right. Stand at Topwithens on a winter afternoon, with the wind coming in off the moor and the clouds racing overhead and the light fading in the west, and you will understand Wuthering Heights in a way that no amount of reading can teach you. You will understand it in your body, in your bones, in the cold that seeps through your clothes and the wind that pushes against your chest and the vast, empty, beautiful loneliness of a place that does not need you and does not want care whether you stay or go. The Meards do not grieve, the moors do not remember. The moors simply are the way the sky is, the way the wind rain is. They were here before the Brontes, and they will be here after the last copy of Wuthering Heights has crumbled to dust. And there is a strange comfort in that, a comfort that Emily understood better than anyone, the comfort of knowing that the world is larger than your grief, that the heather will bloom again in August, that the streams will run, and the wind will blow, and the sky will be blue or grey, or the colour of hammered pewter, and that none of it will care about you, and that this indifference, this vast, ancient, impersonal going on of things, is not cruelty but grace. The Bronte sisters lived brief, extraordinary, heartbreaking lives. They wrote books that have outlived them by nearly 2 centuries, and that show no sign of fading. They loved each other with a fierce, complicated, private love that sustained them through losses that would have destroyed lesser people. And they died, all 3 of them, before they had the chance to become the women they might have been. The writers they might have become. The mothers and the friends and the old ladies they were never allowed to be. What would Emily have written if she had lived? This is one of the great unanswerable questions of English literature. Wuthering Heights was her only novel. She was 30 when she died, the same age at which many writers are just finding their voice, just beginning to understand what they are capable of. Charlotte had said that Emily was getting better as a writer with extraordinary speed, that the talent was deepening and refining itself with every page she wrote. If tuberculosis had not killed her, if she had lived to be 50 or 60 or 70, if she had written 5 more novels or 10, what would they have been? Would she have explored the moors further, going deeper into the landscape and the psychology of the people who inhabited it? Would she have turned outward, toward the wider world, toward London and the continent and the social upheavals of the Victorian age? Or would she have done something entirely unexpected, something that no one could have predicted? Because that was what Emily always did, the thing that left everyone else standing with their mouths open and their assumptions in ruins. We will never know. The disease took her before she could answer. And the answer, like Emily herself, lies somewhere on the moors, in the heather and the wind and the vast, empty, beautiful silence that she loved more than anything else in the world. Anne, too, deserves more than the footnote that history has given her. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a groundbreaking novel, one of the first in English literature to argue that a woman had the right to leave an abusive marriage. And Anne wrote it with a moral courage that was remarkable for any era and astonishing for the 1840s. She was the youngest, the quietest, the most overlooked of the 3 sisters, but she was not the least. She was, in many ways, the bravest, the one who looked most directly at the ugliness of the world and refused to look away, the one whose novels were most concerned with justice and with the rights of people who had been denied them. And Charlotte, who survived the longest and who bore the heaviest burden, the burden of being the last one standing, the burden of carrying the memory of everyone she had lost, and the knowledge that the world she had known, the world of the parsonage and the moors and the circling of the table, was gone forever. Charlotte, who went to London and met Thackeray, and was celebrated and admired, and who came home to Haworth, and sat alone in the parlour, and listened to the wind and missed her sisters with an ache that never dulled. Charlotte, who married at 38 and was happy for 9 months, and died with her unborn child inside her, the last of the Brontes, the last voice at the table, the last pen scratching on paper in the candlelight, but the books remain, and the moors remain. And if you stand on the hilltop above Haworth on a clear evening, when the sun is setting and the heather is turning gold in the last light, and the wind is dropping to a whisper, and the sky is doing that thing it does in Yorkshire, that slow, extravagant display of colour that looks like the inside of a shell, or the surface of a pearl, if you stand there and you listen, not a voice exactly, not a word, something quieter than that, something older, the sound of the moors breathing, the sound of the wind in the heather, the sound of 3 sisters walking together through a landscape that loved them back in the only way it knew how, by being there, by being beautiful, by being wild, by going on. Rest well tonight wherever you are. And if you find yourself lying in the dark listening to the wind, remember that the wind has been blowing across those moors for longer than anyone can remember, and that somewhere in its sound there are stories of love and loss and courage and genius. Stories written by 3 women in a small stone house at the edge of the world. Stories that the wind carries across the hilltops and into the darkness, steady and clear and infinitely gentle. Good night.